Okay, so I'm going to get into definition lists here, or description lists, I mean. I haven't used these quite as often, but they do have some use, especially from an instructional context. And they demonstrate really how HTML is intended to be a structural language, one that really defines the intent of the content, rather than focusing so much on the presentation, but really structuring your content so that the browser or a style sheet or some kind of another program can come along and can actually separate the intent of one type of content from another type of content because of the structural elements that are used to define it. So a description list is an example of that here in HTML. So a description list allows you to essentially set up terms and definitions. So we're going to start it out. The parent element for this is DL. Oh, and I forgot my closing tag. And then you essentially you specify what's the term and what is the definition. So a DT, DL. So let's see, doe, a deer, a female, deer, ray, a drop of golden sun. There we go. And you see what happens up here at the top. We have our definition term, and then we have our definition. And really what it does is it gives it a little bit of structure where you see the definition that follows being indented. But what's really most important is what's happening here in terms of actually defining structurally that you're identifying a term and identifying a definition. So you can go in on a style sheet and you can give these additional style, and a screen reader can go through and can say, okay, this is a definition term, this is a definition. And that way somebody who's not necessarily looking at it can understand what it is that's happening. So that's a definition list or a description list for you. Okay, let's talk a little bit about entity characters. Okay, so you remember back in Unit 1 we talked a little bit about how the browser treats multiple spaces as really one space. Hello, put in a bunch of spaces, world, and you'll notice up here the browser just interprets that as one space. Now what if we want multiple spaces? Well, that's where we can introduce entity codes. So certain special characters that might be interpreted differently in the source code, get their own entity codes. So for example, a space, so we can create an entity. There's an entity for a non-breaking space in BSP. And you'll notice as I add these are actually being treated as additional spaces by the browser. So non-breaking space is something that if we were to keep adding these non-breaking spaces, a non-breaking space is treated like a character that's really part of the, almost like it's part of the word that it's connected to. So if we were to keep adding these and we were to add them until we came all the way out to the end of this line, what would happen is when we got to the end of this line, world would just pop down with all of these spaces because they don't actually break in the middle like a regular space does. Okay, so something that's unique to note about entity codes though is usually there's certain predefined entity codes that usually start with an ampersand and they end with a semicolon like you see here. Then there are codes that are less common that use instead numeric values to indicate what the code is. But these entity codes are reserved for characters that might mean something else in the source code. So for example, hello world, quotation you'll notice as we've gone through in our HTML, occasionally we have attributes that are putting values in quotation marks, and so quotation mark in HTML means something else to the browser. It means this might be encompassing enclosing a value. Now most browsers are pretty forgiving and will actually write a quotation mark as a quotation mark these days, but if you want to be really technical, you can use an entity code to indicate a quotation mark. And then there's no confusion. The browser knows that it's supposed to display a quote, that it's supposed to actually display it, and it's not supposed to interpret the code or the character as something that's defining something else for the browser. Okay, let's look at some of the other entity codes that are common. Sometimes you might want to have an M dash, which is a longer dash, or you might say hello world, that place where we live. Or you might have an ampersand itself, rather than, here we're using an ampersand all the time to start off an entity code. What if you actually want an ampersand? There's actually an entity code for that. And then there's entity codes for things like angle brackets, or greater than. It actually is less than or greater than is how it works out. So if you wanted to actually create the appearance of a p tag in HTML without actually making it a p tag, you could use less than, p, greater than. You get the idea. So that's roughly how entity codes work. Now I usually have to keep bookmarked a list of entity tags, and I'll often use the W3 Schools list and then just go look it up when I'm needing to use one. And that can be handy, so keep some of those nearby.